translators did with the hadith transmitters. They looked at their credibility. And if they were very credible, and all of the people in the chain of transmission were credible, then we say that particular report, hadith, is credible and verifiable, and we believe it. Right? And that's kind of how the world operates. And to think otherwise, you're just missing kind of how everybody operates. It's not kind of unique to Muslims. So the earlier generation, specifically those closest to the Prophet ﷺ, like the Sahaba, the companions, the Tabi'een, were equipped with this requisite knowledge without using specific terminology that developed later on during the formalization of Islam's disciplines. Right? So if someone says, well, did the Sahaba talk about this stuff you're talking about, like Sahih Hadith and Hasan, or did they talk about istinbat or istidlal, and did they say evidence, and did they say all these things? Quran, Sunnah, and Ijma' and Qiyas, were these terms around? And no, I would say definitely they were not around. No question about that. However, does that preclude the idea that they are reflecting a reality that was there, even though we gave them names? Right? So we look at the meanings, not the names. So the names may have come later on, but the names were there and necessary to articulate a particular reality that was there. Right? Anyone who studies tajweed, for example, I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt that all the terminology that you learned and how to recite the Quran was not there during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. They didn't have idgham, or idhar, or idgham bi ghunna, and qalqala, and all these terms of how to properly recite the Quran. Those came later, but they were articulating things that were reality. Right? So when the Arabs used to say, Qul huwa Allahu ahad, right, and qalqala, and on the last letter of the dad, because it has a sukoon, and you're supposed to have a repetitive nature to it, ahad. Where did they get that from? They knew that based upon the transmission. That's how it was recited. But they said, well, we want to record this and document this, so let's give it a name. Let's call it qalqala, for example. Not exactly like that, but yeah, it's something to that effect. So the scholars of fiqh did the same thing, right? This thing where even the companions would compare one particular thing they knew for sure, and then they had a new situation that was no particular hadith or ayah about it, but they wanted to compare the two. What would they do? Well, they did something, right? We call it qiyas now, right? We gave it a name, but the reality was there. So their minds and hearts were of the nature that they applied these things. Maybe you can argue not in as much a sophisticated way that was acquired later on, right? Because we're still talking about a very sort of 7th century Arabian society. It's not going to be as complex or complicated as 13th century Baghdad, for example, which became much more complex. However, nevertheless, the techniques were there. They were being used. And there was a period of time, and even academics call it the formation or the formative years of Islam, where I wouldn't say Islam was being formed so much, but rather realities that were already existing were being articulated and canonized, documented, verbally, and so forth, so that later generations can understand what exactly was going on. Same thing with Arabic language. There was none of the terminology that we use now to study Arabic was not back then. The word of i'rab, right, which is kind of the signature aspect of language, Arabic language, that each letter has a type of diacritical mark, and the words in the sentence have to conform to a particular way, and so forth. They didn't have that word for it, but the concept certainly was there, right? Because they spoke with i'rab, right, without necessarily having words or rules to define it, but it was known nonetheless. So even if we say, despite all of that, second point here, even amongst those early generations, a number of those companions and followers were at a level of istinbat, even though they were all Arabs and had mastery of the language. The ones that could actually go to the Quran and Sunnah and make legal rulings or derive legal rulings were very few. There weren't that many, a handful, right? Some of the names we know, like Sayyidah Aisha, the four Khulafa, Ibn Umar, Ibn Abbas, Ibn Mas'ud. We're talking about tens, out of 10,000 companions thereabouts, right? Actually 100,000 companions thereabouts, and maybe only 10,000 were hadith narrators. And out of those 10,000 hadith narrators, we're talking maybe, 100, maybe less than that, who were actually fuqaha. So we're still looking at even a small percentage grouping from the general populace, right? And this goes by the same concept that's mentioned in the Quran, Surah At-Tawbah, the last verse in Surah At-Tawbah. It says that لولا نفر من كل فرقة منهم يتفقهوا في الدين وليرجعوا إليه ولينظروا إذا رجعوا إليه. If it were not for a group from each society to stay and يتفقه في الدين, right? فقه, to learn fiqh, so that when they came back, this is the people going on the campaigns, right? Who were constantly going on campaigns. So that some people had to stay behind and perfect this understanding of religion, so that when they came back, that they would advise them and teach them. Otherwise, if everybody were to go, who's left to learn and who's left to preserve the tradition to teach to others? And so it was still nafal. Nafal means a group, small number, doesn't mean everybody. The reason I emphasize this because there was a period in our history, we're still kind of going through it, where there was this type of claim, dawah, that everyone should be their own faqih. And everyone should go to the Quran and Sunnah and learn it for themselves, and not depend upon scholarship or authoritative scholarship. And this started with the Salafi movement in Egypt, people like Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida and their Sheikh, Jamal al-Din Afghani. They were kind of proponents of this particular way of thinking. And there's a long history behind that and why they thought that way, and British colonialism and a lot of other issues that were kind of at the forefront at the time. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's our estimation that that particular, you know, style or that particular approach they were taking, I think, was faulty. It was to ask everyone to do it. One, you're kind of dismissing the skills that are required to figure that part out. And two, you're dismissing 1,000 years of scholarship and saying that's kind of all irrelevant. We all need to be doing this for ourselves. So the last point, different methodologies for deriving legal rulings developed as a result of different methodologies amongst the companions. Right, the companions themselves differed about certain things, about how they should go about doing certain things. Probably the most famous example of that is the Prophet ﷺ was heading for Khaybar, and there was a group that left before him. And so he told them, when you reach Bani Qurayza, which is the Jewish tribe at Khaybar, when you reach there, then you are to pray Asr, offer the Asr prayer. So they got on their way, and then they were feeling that Maghrib prayer was coming close. And they may not make it in time if they were to wait and go all the way to Bani Qurayza. So they differed about what they should do. Some of the groups said, we will follow exactly what the Prophet said. He said, don't pray Maghrib, don't pray Asr until you reach your destination. And others said, yes, but we think he meant as long as the prayer time is not going to go out, because we know that the prayer time at sunset there's no more Asr. So some of them stayed behind and prayed, and the others went ahead. When they reached later on, and the Prophet ﷺ met them, and they explained the situation to him, he did not say these people were wrong or that people were right. He stayed silent. In other words, he kind of allowed both interpretive methods. Right? And one interpretive method you could say would be called more of the textual interpretive method, and another one is sort of more of the reasoning or intellectual interpretive method. They're not mutually exclusive. But the first one we call al-zahir, in other words, going by the kind of apparent meaning of the text, whether it be an ayah or hadith. And the other one is, well, let's give some context to it. Right? At the end of the day, we say that the ones who prayed right then and there didn't wait to get to Bani Qurayza. They were the ones who were actually correct, right? Because we know that you don't offer the Asr prayer after Maghrib. Right? That's a general principle. So whenever you have a single text, like the command here of the Prophet ﷺ, it has to be understood in light of the holistic sense of what are all the rules and precepts and regulations that refer to that particular issue. However, the interpretive method they use is not incorrect, but perhaps the application in that particular time. But even though that application we could disagree with it, the Prophet ﷺ didn't tell them they were wrong. Right? He still told them that what you did was correct in terms of your method, even though the result that came out may have been faulty. So the companions differed about some of these issues, how they go about it, how they interpret it. And this is due to the fact Prophet ﷺ did not reveal a particular methodology. He didn't say, understand the Quran this way. In fact, when he'd be asked certain questions, the Quran would reveal a verse about that particular issue. يسألونك عن الروح. They ask you about concerning ahilla, about the crescent moons. They ask you about women's menstrual cycle. They ask you about the anfal, the spoils of war. They ask you about the spirit or the soul. So these are questions that were addressed directly to the Prophet ﷺ, and then the Quran will give the answer to that. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he really did not, what we would say in our terms today, do tafsir of the Quran. The Prophet ﷺ didn't have like a halaqah, a weekly one, where he did tafsir, or he would recite the verses and then say, well, this means that, and this means this. Occasionally, like if someone had a question about something that they weren't sure of in the verse, he would answer that question, right? Like Sayyidah Aisha in Bukhari, she asked the Prophet ﷺ about the hisab, right? About the verse that وَمَنْ أُوتِيَ كِتَابَهُ بِيَمِينِهِ فَسَوْفَ يُحَاسَبُ حِسَابًا يَسِيرًا. And whoever receives his kitab from his right, he will have an easy reckoning. So the reckoning will be easy for him. She said, how do we understand that? And you mentioned that مَنْ نُوقَشَ فِي الْحِسَابِ فَقَدْ عُذِّبَ. Whoever his discussion is brought about his reckoning, then it's a type of punishment. But the verse says it's not a punishment. So how do we understand it too? So she had a question about that. And this is something that the Prophet ﷺ didn't answer when she brought up that question. But generally speaking, he did not sort of go in a line by line, verse by verse explanation of every verse in the Quran. That was often the Sahaba, being who they were, they understood and interpreted in the way that they were endowed to do so. Okay.
So what do you say about the Sahaba being able to interpret it, and the people that say that they were the ones that able to interpret it, and that later generations shouldn't make that attempt?
On what basis would you say that?
I mean, this is the basis that that's presented, that because of these generations had a preservation or preserved that.
No, what the Sahaba did for us is they showed us how to approach the Quran and Sunnah. We're following their methodologies, what they did. We're not going outside of what they did. Okay. Right? But none of the Sahaba, we don't have a complete tafsir, for example, Ibn Abbas. Even though he was known as Turjuman al-Quran and the one who had great knowledge of the Quran, we don't have something complete. We have narrations about what he said about particular verses. Well, we certainly don't have a complete tafsir by any means. That, in fact, that discipline of tafsir is something that came about somewhat later, based upon some of the sayings of like Ibn Abbas and Mujahid and Qatada and many of the other ones who were considered to be exegetes of the Quran. And then there are different types of ways of understanding the Quran. That type of tafsir is called a tafsir al-athar of al-riwayah. That's tafsir based upon specific hadith, which is valid, but it doesn't invalidate other ways. Right? You can go by the language itself. Right? They say tafsir al-lughawi, going by the meanings that are apparent in the language, as long as they don't contradict anything of the main principles. That was the methodology that the Prophet ﷺ established, and the Sahaba. Right? And so to say that we have to do exactly as they did, the more correct thing would be, if they were amongst us today, what would they do? That's the more, I would say, the more proper way to look at it. Not do we have to do exactly as they did in the 7th century. Yeah.
So they interpreted it in different ways without changing the meaning?
No, the nature of the language, the nature of the verse is that it's open to interpretation. That you can make an argument for more than one interpretation. If you open any tafsir of Quran, you will find several different opinions about sometimes each verse, about what it means. But when we say what it means, it's not like there's this wide, big difference between all of them. We're talking about subtleties, about certain things. So that means when they agree about something, then it's support, it's heavy. It's a consensus at that point. That means if they all agree on the same thing and they all have all these different methodologies, but nevertheless these different methodologies converge on a single opinion, then that's why when we get to ijma', we say that it's a hujjah, it's qat'i. It's not something you should go against. Because despite their differences, they still arrive at the same conclusion. Right? And that doesn't happen a whole lot, but it happens often enough that, as we said in the last terms class, it forms a boundary. Right? So if you go outside of ijma', then you're kind of going outside of the boundary of how we define what Sunni Islam is. what is fit? Why not just follow the Quran and Sunnah? It sounds reasonable. So let's take it step by step. One's obligation is to follow the prophetic teachings. I don't think anyone has a disagreement about that. And I don't think anyone would disagree that the discipline of fiqh is a means by which to do that. Right? So the Quran and Sunnah, while accessible to all Muslims in terms of recitation and contemplation, nonetheless requires a specialist level of ability to interpret in the sense of deriving legal rulings. This is where perhaps the difference between what we say and what those who are saying Quran and Sunnah. In their mind, actually, but not in reality. Because in reality, they too are following someone else. Right? They too are following someone else's opinions. They just don't want to call them one of the four schools. And that person that they're following on opinions, they actually are following the four schools. Right? Because they're picking and choosing, but nevertheless, usually it falls within the four schools. So whether they realize it or not, they're still following the four schools, even though they're saying Quran and Sunnah. So this requires a division of labor and recognition of scholarly authority in terms of understanding the prophetic teachings. And every man for himself paradigm, as has been advocated by some Muslims, has proved disastrous and threatens to upend an accessible understanding and practice of Islam for contemporary Muslims. And I believe we're almost there right now at this point, where it will soon become more difficult to define what some call normative or mainstream Islam is. Because it will just seem like a whole bunch of different factions and sects who don't really get along and they all think different things, and we can't tell who's the mainstream and all of that. And that's my view. That will kind of, at least for the average person, it's hard to discern. Right? You're looking at factions in all over the place, all different parts of the world, and it seems sectarian, even though it's probably more political than sectarian, but it's being presented as sectarian. So it's hard to define where, what's the right thing, right? And people used to know what the right thing was, is because there was sort of an acceptance, a broad acceptance of scholarly authority. And even within that acceptance of scholarly authority, they had their differences between them. But as a whole, right, taking as sort of a comprehensive whole, that formed the basis of how we know the deen. Nowadays, that is being challenged. Not just challenged, but upended completely in some places. So to mention the idea of following scholarly authority is controversial. And we even have, unfortunately, in the States, there are people that are saying, well, that whole system is patriarchal to begin with. They were all men. There were no women there. So that means we can't follow any of it because they took it from a very chauvinistic, patriarchal, paternalistic point of view. And as a result, how could we need to have female interpretation of the Quran, and female text, and female this, and so forth. And to me, it's taking a contemporary understanding of male-female or gender-specific issues and trying to superimpose it back in time on something where that was not the meaning back then. Right? Would it hurt to have female scholars? No, obviously not. We're not talking about that. But we're saying to dismiss the whole thing outright because it doesn't conform to a particular conception that you have based upon your contemporary circumstances. I think that's no better than the people who are saying Quran and Sunnah and forget everything that happened in between. So you have people on one side of the extreme saying forget all that happened in between, only the Sahaba and the Prophet and us, right, and dismiss the 1,000 years in between. And then there are other people on the other side of the spectrum who are saying the same thing, but they're not saying Quran and Sunnah, they're saying us too. We have to do it over again. Right? Where to me the more balanced approach is definitely our history wasn't perfect, definitely there were fuqaha. We don't agree with everything they did and they said, and it's subject to sort of scrutiny, no question about that. But what people don't realize is many of these things have been scrutinized. Right? Why 4 schools? Why only 4? Well, you might ask a question. Why not 8? Why not 10? Why not 3? Because they survived the test of time and scrutiny. That's why it's 4. Right? People don't realize that it took quite a bit of time and development to get to the particular 4 that we have now. There were more than that. Right? During the time of the early Imams, we had the Awza'i, who was Sufyanaini, and Imam al-Tabari was considered Mujtahid. We had many of those, right? Who could have been like one of the 4 schools, but they didn't end up that way. Right? One of the schools that was actually survived for a little bit, but eventually couldn't survive, was what called al-Zahiri. Right? And the Zahiri school was that which goes by literal interpretation. They denied that there was anything that could be understood figuratively in the Quran or the Hadith. So everything had to be understood literally. It didn't survive. Why? Because it was a dinosaur. How could you go on? You couldn't sustain that because you're going to come across situations where not a literal interpretation every single time is not going to work. Right? So it didn't stand the test of time. So I would submit if these interpretations truly were patriarchal, or whatever they say about them, or problematic or defective in whichever way that people are saying, they would have not withheld or underwent the test of time and scrutiny over this millennium, over 1,000 years. They wouldn't have survived. But they did, right? And we're still here today. And there's still chains of transmissions going back to these particular 4 schools. So that, to me, is a testament to that these are our authorities. Much in the same way that people don't realize the Quran itself is transmitted by authority, authoritative scholarship. Right? If you just say just Quran without qira'ah, you don't know what you're talking about. Right? If someone just said, I just want to learn Quran, and then I ask you, well, what qira'ah would you like to learn? You want to learn Hafs, or Asim, or Shu'ba, or Shu'ba and Asim, or you want to learn Qalun, or Websh, or Durri? Which one? So if you look, what we're talking about. Quran al Quran. Right? Bismillah Quran. You got to tell me which riwayah you want, which narration you want. Because that's how we know the Quran, via authoritative scholarship. So that's how we know it. And if you try to do it any other way, you won't find any other way. Go take up your Mus'haf that was printed in Medina, and look at the back, and open to the last page, and see the committee that approved it. And it will say which qira'ah, which narration it is. And it will say Hafs and Asim. Hafs was a scholar, Asim was a scholar. Quranic scholars, and that's the narration that most people read today. It's not the only one, right? If you go to North Africa, you'll find different. In Yemen, it's different qira'ah. Subtle differences between the two. I don't get into the differences right now, but that's how we know Quran. So much in the same way, if you say, just give me fiqh, and I'll say, well, which madhab? Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanafi, Hanbali. No. I just want fiqh. Well, I can't help you because it came via authoritative scholars. I don't have another way to transmit it. So this sort of, what people think is a high-level abstraction is clever, it's actually ignorant, because there's no other way for you to actually receive it otherwise. Yeah.
What's their agenda, though? Why would they do that? Why would they dumb it down, for lack of a better word? That's not disrespectful. I mean, why you want to simplify it in that sense? What are you going to gain out of doing that?
I don't think that's their intention to dumb down or simplify. I think what their intentions lie in something in other alternative agendas that's not really about preserving the tradition as it is, but sometimes it's political, sometimes I think it's a way for people to kind of present themselves as the authority. Because when you're saying someone else's, then it's not you. Right? And then it opens up the door that you're the ones who's going to talk. You're going to be the authority. Right? In that sense. And I think the original movement with Muhammad Abdul Rashid Rida, I think, began as a reaction to what were probably legitimate concerns at the time. This particular paradigm we're describing, there was a time in the late Ottoman period where it got a little bit heavy, and it got to the point where it was so heavy and burdensome to learn that it was almost falling upon itself. And there definitely had to be reforms in the way maybe it was taught, the way it was presented, but not in the structural integrity of the whole thing. But they attacked both. So I'm the one who's at Al-Azhar, he did attack the way things were being taught, and also they were living with the burden of inferiority complex to the West. Much of what's going on in the Muslim world now has to go back to that time. Because when you're scratching your head and you're trying to figure out what's wrong with us, why are we so far behind? How is it that they came so easily to our shores and penetrated our defenses and taken everything over and now penetrated our culture as well? And now they've even colonized our minds because we think there's something wrong with us. So you look back to yourself and you say, oh, it's the tasawwuf. Oh, no, it's the madhabs. I don't know, this thing is wrong. Oh, maybe we're just too much Islam. So you had all of these kind of different justifications of why things went wrong, why we find ourselves, the ummah, collectively in a defensive position, as a result of reaction to Western colonialism. And so you saw across the board, from India, Pakistan, all the way to the Arab world, this similar type of reactive approach to what was happening to them. So I'm not one to judge, I don't know, I didn't live during that time, but I can imagine how difficult it must have been. Because realize that prior to colonialism, Muslims could never have fathomed that those heathens from the north would come and take us over. It was like completely, it's like us here, and we're thinking that North Korea could possibly invade America and take over. I don't know what we're talking about. It's like a joke. But that was what it was like for Muslims for a lot of their history. In fact, they had little interest in what was going on in Europe, right? They just knew there were people who smelled bad, they didn't shower that much, they could barely read, they didn't know how to write. That's what they thought of them. And so they didn't have any interest in it. And the Muslim world was kind of the center of civilization. Places like Cordoba, Damascus, even in Africa. Look how Africa's look now. But there was a time Africa, Timbuktu, Mali, Senegal, these were centers of learning, right? The richest man in the world lived in Africa, even by today's standards, right? These were kingdoms that were established there. People don't realize. Timbuktu, Mali in general, was a crossroads of civilization for a long time. Right? Now people look at Africa like the backwards continent. But that wasn't what it was for a long time. And so the colonization of the mind, as somehow put it, has resulted in a lot of these reactive postures that are being taken to what's going on. And as a result, you have the extreme on one end say, it's Islam, that's the problem. And then you have, so that was the modernist, right? And that was reflected in places like Mustafa Kemal in Turkey. Well, Islam is the problem. We're going to be strong when we have a strong nationalistic, even secularistic approach to the way that we live. And then you had sort of like, no, it's not the right, or it's not enough Islam, or it's not Islam that's geared towards the modern era. So you have many of the sort of activist Islamist movements come about, taking that posture. And then, you have people who didn't know what to think, didn't know what to do. But at the same time, this particular paradigm didn't really live up to the task. They were greatly weakened. Many of the traditional Muslim institutions like Al-Azhar and Zaytuna and Qarawiyyin in Morocco were weakened considerably. And so they didn't have the voice, neither with the ruling elite, nor with the populace that they used to have. And as a result, people started looking for other channels for religious direction and authority. So nowadays, there was a time when Al-Azhar was the religious authority. No one listened to anything else. Now Al-Azhar is seen as government arm, and therefore less reliable and less trustworthy, because they're seen as some group or institution that is reflecting government policy. People don't trust the government, and so on. And so this is kind of the cycle that we're finding ourselves in. So, despite the shortcomings of the institutions that were reflected in the paradigm, there's no question that was happening, definitely. But I think the methodology is sound. It just wasn't taken and applied, I think, at a critical juncture where it needed to be because of the trauma. We're still in a collective PTSD, I think. Post-traumatic stress disorder, all of it, like the whole homeless like that. And it's getting worse. It's like we had an open wound, and now salt is being rubbed in it. There's this stuff that's happening now. This is the time where you hang out to your deen as much as you can. That's what I think. So the relationship of fiqh to the other disciplines, and I stress this aspect because they're all understood together. You'll never find like a contradiction, right? It's not like when you go sit in your psychology class and then you go sit in your biology class and you feel like they have two different worldviews. They're not, the way the psychologists see the world is completely different the way than the biologists see the world, or the economists, right? They all see it via their little prism. And so that means what they hold to be certainly true is different depending upon each different discipline, right? And so you kind of have to, you're either an economist or a biologist, but you can't be both, right? Because it would be like a split personality. Either you believe that economic forces run the world, or you believe at the end of the day it's all biology. In the dominant paradigm in each specialization, not like everybody thinks that, but that's kind of the general gist. Whereas in Islamic disciplines, read across all of it, and it all fits as a piece of a puzzle. There is no different worldview between all of them. So they're understood in a holistic manner. They share a common epistemology and methodology. So that which is, for example, considered to be knowledge in the realm of fiqh is the same as what's considered to be knowledge in Aqidah, or in Tasawwuf, or in Quran Tafsir, or in Hadith. They don't differ about that. So one will not say this is knowledge and then this one is not. They might say for our purposes, like Aqidah, we don't take that except from Quran or Sahih Hadith. Whereas the Fuqaha will take rulings from something that's less than a Sahih Hadith, less than a written surah, Hadith. Why? Because their methodology allows for that. Because fiqh is not in terms of the significance of such actions as important as Aqidah, which is your belief system, how you see the world. So that has to be more stringent. Whereas when we're talking about fiqh, it can be a little bit less. But they're not at odds, right? They're just saying, different ways of looking at things for different circumstances. And so all of them, the ulama, they came early on with this idea of the 10 beginning principles of Mabadi' al-Ashra, of how one is to define a particular discipline. And some of them wrote like this 4 lines of poetry, just to remember them. من رام فنا فليقدم أولا علما بحده وموضوع تلا وواضع والنسبة ما استمد منه وخطه وحكم يعتمد واسمه ما أفاد والمسائل فتلك 10 هنا I think وسائل وبعضهم فيها عن البعض اقتصر ومن يكن يدري جميعها انتصر. So he's saying these are the 10 beginning principles, and I'm going to outline them more in the next slide. So if we take them and apply them to fiqh, we come up with these. So their name, definition, the subject matter or subject, the founder, the affiliation, the source, the virtue of it, the issues that it would address, what are the benefits of studying this particular discipline, and finally the ruling, do I have to learn it or not? So for each one of the Islamic disciplines, these can be applied. So for fiqh in general, we say the name is ilm al-fiqh, knowledge of fiqh, whatever jurisprudence. Definition, the knowledge of legal rulings using evidentiary methods, as we said.